I said, darling, even if they clip your wings, you can still fly.
Hey, what's up everybody? This is Lindsay Lerner, and you're listening to The Cost of the Status Quo. More people than ever are questioning why they do what they do and forging their own path. And on this show, I sit down with these entrepreneurs, trailblazers, creatives, and overall awesome beings to discuss the ideas, the opportunities, and the overall tips and tricks they're using so that the rest of us can do the same. This is The Cost of the Status Quo. Today we are here with two incredible folks, Melissa and Jonathan Nightingale. Talk about a dream team. Melissa has been having adventures in the startup world since the first .com boom. During that time, she has held senior leadership roles in marketing, PR, and strategy at ridiculously high-paced startups like Wattpad and Mozilla. Jonathan has built and operated organizations from 2 to 250 people. Previously, he was the vice president of Firefox at Mozilla. Since then, they have gone on to become founders and partners at Raw Signal Group. As if that all weren't enough, these folks also write incredible books like How Fucked Up Is Your Management and Unmanageable. We'll dive into a bit of those stories today, but we will also be diving into how and why they've carved these paths for themselves. Melissa and Jonathan will share a bit about their stories and the tips, tricks, and habits they've learned along the way. Listeners, thank you so much for listening. It would mean the world to me if you subscribed, rated, and reviewed this. Welcome, Melissa and Jonathan. Thank you so much for making the time to be here.
Thank you, Lindsay.
It's great to be here.
So let's go all the way back. Where did you both grow up? And how do you think it's shaped your perspective?
I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland.
I grew up in Toronto. Well, outside of Toronto. I grew up in the burbs.
I feel like I'm voted least likely to have ended up in Toronto. Like I'm here now, but in terms of like the path from Baltimore to Toronto, it's sort of a windy one.
Yeah, none of the paths make sense. Like I grew up in Brampton, and I was convinced I was going to go into like psychoanalysis, like psychotherapy. So I mean, that didn't pan out.
No, and I grew up in Baltimore, but like didn't make any sense there either. And was like, as soon as I am able to not be here, I will be somewhere else. And basically like was there until I was 17 and then not.
And what happened post Baltimore?
I went to undergrad in DC, dropped out of high school, actually.
Excellent.
Just going there. Dropped out of high school and was like, got to figure out what's next. And a university in DC was like, we'll accept you without a high school diploma. I was like, great, because I don't have one of those. And then my high school in Baltimore retroactively issued me a diploma. So I actually have a high school diploma because they wanted to count me on their matriculation rates. They were like, basically, you're in university now, or like you're in college now. And it would be really good for our rep to say that like we knew you when. And so I have a high school diploma, but like only through a loophole.
It's funny. One of the things that we have in common is that both of us went to school for a thing right around the time that the first .com boom was happening. So like late 90s. And I'll say for myself, like I went in, like I liked computers. Computers made sense to me, but like that wasn't what I was going to do. But just for giggles, as one of my electives in first year, I took a computers course, basic like an entry level programming course, and I was like, oh shit, and then had to just change my major, and so I studied this like mix of things, but computers had to be part of it. Like it was really clear that tech was a place I was going.
And similarly, like I was literally the person in the dorms that everyone was like, my computer broke and my paper is due in the morning and I'm freaking out. And I was like, I could fix your computer.
Where do you think that knowledge came from? You just like figured it out?
So I think like we both came up in the phase of computers where things broke a lot. And so if you liked technology, you had to really love it because you're like committing to not only like enjoying using it, but also like troubleshooting it along the way.
You hear this from musicians, right? They pick up a guitar for the first time, and even though their fingers hurt, they're like, I get this. This makes sense to me, right? Like,
I have heard that before.
Yeah. So my fingers hurt a lot with computers, but you start to get into it, and like that's rewarding instead of purely painful. And so then you do a little bit more, and then you do a little bit more. And back then, I think you could still hold all the pieces of a computer in your head and understood how they work together in a way that's much harder now.
Well, yeah. I mean, like back then it was like if you needed to fix a thing, you needed a screwdriver. And like that's so not true today.
You've both spent the entirety of your careers so far in tech. What do you think the difference is between tech during the .com boom that you're talking about and now?
Okay, so some things are the same. It's still ageist. It still really expects you to be very young. It expects you to have no outside commitments. It really expects you. I mean, there's exceptions to every rule, but like in general, as an industry, it is an industry that rewards working 60, 80-hour work weeks and not having a lot of problem being flown all over the world and not having any commitments that you're worried about leaving behind.
I think in terms of tech then, or at least for my own self, like tech then, I couldn't imagine what could go wrong. Like I spent so much of my early career in tech thinking about what like how cool it would be if it went right. I spent almost 0% of my time thinking about like, how could this be weaponized? What will happen if this technology spreads and is wildly successful? Are there any potential downsides of that? And I think technology today, like, I don't know, a lot of folks are out there building technology without any of those questions, but at least those questions exist. And I think, 20 years ago when we were getting started, it was really easy to just say, this is an unmitigated good that I am unleashing on the world. Not as much today.
You see vibes of it in like nascent tech communities now. You see some people in like, Web3 land talking like this, but in the early days of the internet, at least of the web, it was grungy. It didn't make a lot of sense. People weren't sure how to make money from it. And even the .com boom, like there was a ton of fundraising around it, but most of the time without a business model. Like it was like, let's build this thing.
So that's one of the things that's still the same.
Yeah, right. But now like outside of the sort of frontier areas of tech, there's much more of an established, I go to work 9 to 5. I'm in the code mines, right? And I get paid very well for it. But like Microsoft has a business model. Amazon has a business model. There's tech that's just industrial, eat the world scale now in a way that back then it was all very scrappy.
As folks who've been in tech for a really long time, you look for where there's play. Like where are people using technology to be playful? Where are they using technology to do cool, weird art that doesn't really make a ton of sense? Like that there are still pockets of fun, but so much of tech is like being aware that at some point that pocket of fun is going to be like massively commercialized and stop being fun, or at least stop being fun for the like early artists that were playing with it once upon a time. And so I think so much of how we've stayed interested in technology is just sort of looking around every 6 months or so and just saying, where are people playing and doing cool stuff?
I mean, not to be too on the nose about it, but like when we started, tech was not the status quo, right? And now it is. Like whatever industry you're in, there's a pretty quick answer to how has tech changed this industry, right? How has tech consumed this industry and monetized this industry? And that's true for art. It's true for farming. It's true for writing. Like it's true across the board. And that is different from 20 years ago.
Right. And when you're going through that process, is that a specific process that you're really going through time and time again every 6 months, some sort of checklist, or is it more of this gut feeling that you're kind of walking through being like, is this okay? Is this not okay? Are there repercussions to my actions? What do I do?
It's not accurate to say, okay, there's a calendar alarm that goes off every 6 months. That's like, stay fucking on top of technology. Like, have you done that recently? No, like it's much more of an integrated, I'd say like it's the water that we swim in so much.
Yeah. I think again, it's sort of more attractive to draw parallels to other artistic pursuits than to other business pursuits, right? That like you can figure it out pretty quickly if you're jamming with someone and that's working or not. If it's like a project that you're excited about or a collaboration that you're excited about, or not. If you see somebody else doing stuff and you're like, man, we should find something to do together because I love what you're doing, you don't need a calendar reminder for it. The flip side is I'll say like in terms of our business, we have built structure around not doing the work we don't want to do, right? So we do have like policies around like, we won't work with weapons manufacturers, right? We won't work with tobacco companies. Like there are places where we've put structures in place for ourselves to say like, that's, our work works and we don't want to help the organizations that are doing things that we can't stand behind.
Totally. And in terms of your work, in terms of leadership training, I've heard a lot of folks say that great leaders are born, not made. And I know you two believe otherwise. So if you could speak a little bit to how do you two go about the process of teaching people to become great leaders?
I mean, the first way that we teach people to become great leaders is we basically like put a bullet in the head of the idea that like you have to be born with it. That like no one comes out of the womb like organizing the other babies in daycare, right? Like it's not a thing that happens. And so somewhere between like being in daycare and like being in the workforce, a set of things happen, and we teach people a set of things, or folks like observe a set of things, or they get excited about a role model that they've got in the workforce. But I think the thing that we do that is the least helpful is we couch all management and leadership in mysticism. Of like, either you have it or you don't. Either you're like a natural born leader or you're not. Either like you sort of like you have the skills or you don't have the skills. And we somehow accept the framing that if you don't have the skills, they're not attainable. Except every other area of the workforce, we talk about skilling you up and mentorship. And we talk about the idea that like you need to sort of like hone your craft, except for management and leadership where we're like, oh, well, it's a light switch. And if it's not on, you're fucked.
It's so self-serving too, right? Like, okay, so the history books are full of a bunch of like old white men. And if great leaders are born, then like basically we're being racist right now, right? Like then basically we're saying like they're born and genetically the birthright that causes you to be a great leader. If I go and read this book, must be, you know, people who look like this and not anybody else. And it's just such garbage. Like nobody who's trying to break in and trying to work on themselves and getting better at this stuff and being really studious says that. The people who say that are people who are lazy, who had it handed to them.
Part of what's hard about getting better at this stuff, like we'll meet bosses who are like, I'm looking to improve, right? Like I'm really trying to actually like show up for my people in a real way. And one of the things that's hard is that like leadership and management as a set of topics, like the skill isn't leadership. The skill is like the 600 pieces that go underneath that, but we don't articulate the 600 things. And so we're left with this like this blob concept of like, oh, I need to get better at this thing. But like, what does that actually mean? And when you're like, okay, well, like part of that is going to be giving like feedback to your people. And they're like, oh, that, like I need that. And you're like, okay, well, once you make it a clear skill that you can improve on, guess what happens? Like people improve relatively quickly.
What's the difference between the leadership training that you're doing and assisting people with and more of that internal work that also needs to be done that I would argue is a common thread between at least the 25 plus people I've interviewed so far?
We don't put a lot of sunlight between those two things, but a lot of writing on management does. A lot of people, if you go and write, you go to an airport bookstore, it's full of garbage business books, and like pick any of them at random, ideally one written by a white dude. He will talk about how strategic he was, about how like he saw things really clearly. And it's just this one note, things were really hard, but I got us through, right? And there's none of that evidence of reflection. There's none of that evidence of like, here's the struggle. Here's where I made mistakes. Here's where my ego got in the way. And like my people were trying to tell me a thing and I did not listen. There isn't that. But I think you're right that like you can't be authentically great at leadership if you're not doing some of that reflective work. There's even good research, like academic research on this, that like reflection is a core ingredient there. And you don't see it in a lot of the people who get book deals.
When you're trying to get people to think about how they show up as leaders differently, a lot of organizations will start with tearing those people down. They're like, well, we need to like kickstart like self-awareness of the form. You are a fuck up and you should feel bad about the way you're showing up in this job. And from that place, it's really unsafe to make any changes. Like all my shields go up the moment that you tell me like, I'm doing it wrong and I'm doing it terribly. And I have to put down like the only tools that I have that may not even be working for me. And I may even know that they're not working for me. But the minute the conversation is like, you have to put those tools down and you're messing up and we need you to like reinvent yourself overnight. Like it just, if it's not safe to make that change, you're going to find leaders entrenching with like bad habits. And it explains a lot of sort of the way that leadership development happens in organizations today. Is like people want to start from a like, let's tear it all down, let's burn it all down and rebuild you. And like a lot of leaders, that's a very uncomfortable process and it feels very unsafe.
Anybody listening right now who's gone through a 360 review process at work, like that's a trauma phrase for a lot of people, right? And what's funny is that when you talk to people the first time they have one, they're like, this is going to be great. I'm going to get this feedback. I know people have feedback for me, right? Like there's an eagerness to grow and then they just get hit. Melissa's exactly right. You just get torn down on it. And from that point forward, anytime somebody suggests one, you run.
But like if you've built a leadership development program that's about that, like the end result is that you've got leaders entrenched with bad habits that aren't serving them well or the organization, like you have messed up. Like somewhere along the line, you've lost sight of what you're trying to get done.
Oh, for sure. And then I think along those lines too, really differentiating between leadership and management. And those are two very, very different skills.
You're totally right. When people talk about leadership, they're like, you could have no day-to-day responsibilities and still be a leader. You could have no like people management responsibilities and still be a leader. And when people talk about management, they often think about this really bureaucratic thing. But one of the things we push people on is like the words mean different things. That's true. But it doesn't let you off the hook because you need both of them. That like you cannot lead
There's
people
my work.
effectively. You can, yeah, you can lead people and say like, this is what we're trying to get done.
Right.
And they're like, neat boss, but like I've got 7 priorities. So how do you want me to shuffle that? Right. And I need to skill up on these 3 things. And the person who would train me is off doing something else. So like once we get into the weeds, how do you want to actually do that? Right. And like those people just need to build that skill.
And like, it's the obnoxiousness that people are like, okay, well, like leadership, like that's the thing I want to do. But like vacation requests, like, meh, like that doesn't sound that.
That's always their example.
And it's always the example of like what people think management is. And I'm like, in terms of like, I have led a lot of teams, I have managed a lot of people. Like maybe 2% of that time
just
was
doesn't take up that
approving
much
vacation.
time.
I mean, how much time are you spending looking at a calendar?
But like giving people feedback, especially when it's hard, and giving it to them in a way that they can actually hear, man, like I would say, if all you did when you promoted someone into management the first time was sit them down and give them half an hour on that, like let's get you skilled up on that, work would be a totally different place. But the fact is that like you get promoted into management and you don't get that. And so then that person's people don't get that. And so then like they're just wandering around at work stressed all the time, trying to figure out if like their manager's giving them less eye contact and that means they hate them. Like,
and in terms of bringing it sort of all the way back around, like we didn't get that. Like in part of how we got to now, like Jonathan and I got nothing the first time we were promoted into management. Like we got new business cards and nothing else. And it was like, you're in charge of a team of people. That team lives all over the globe. You may not even be in the same labor market or time zone or any overlapping daylight hours with those people. Like off you go. Good luck.
Are there any specific experiences that come to mind as you're building Raw Signal and as you're continuing to do these trainings, whether it's from your personal experience from when you were an employee or even now as you are doing those trainings? Any of those examples come to mind?
We started with this idea that we thought we were only building for tech people. We're startup people, we're tech people, we're nerds by nature. We're like, okay, like we really had the idea that what we were building was specific because we felt like there was a gap and a need for technology organizations and startups where they just weren't training their people. And it was really hard to send them to like traditional management training because industry-wise, it just didn't make sense. And then the more we got going and the more folks really found out like what we were up to, we heard from way different industries and from folks in like just like random stuff that doesn't make any sense for us.
one of the things that's mattered every time we're talking to those people is to give our own examples. I mean, one of the uncomfortable things about trying to run a better kind of management and leadership development program is that you have to go first. Like when it comes to vulnerability, when you ask about stories, like the reason we have so many is that like we have to. People are like, well, when did you screw that up? And like, I know like for me early on as a manager, I cared so much. I'd had such shitty managers. And I'm like, I'm going to be better than all of them. I had managers who were totally absentee. I'm like, we're having every one-on-one every week. We're going to talk. It's not going to be a status update. It's just going to be about how you're doing. It's going to be growth focused, right? And the result was that I was just a great big cuddly teddy bear. But people were screwing up on my team and I was insulating them from that. That's my own screw up. That's my own. Melissa said it. That's just like, nobody gave me any skill on that. They didn't even tell me that was sort of a thing I was accountable for. I outgrew it. I learned that it wasn't working for me. But for the first couple of years there, like I was definitely letting my team down by trying to be so kind, by like being kind enough that like they were just not getting the clarity that they needed.
I had the opposite problem, right? Like I had dropped out of high school. I had a late birthday and I like got finished with university early. And so I was the youngest person in the room by like a lot and often the only woman in the room by like a lot. And so just going into teams and being like, well, I would just be the loudest. I would just solve this by being like the most confident whether I know what I'm doing or not and being the loudest. And in tech, like you can get pretty far by just being the loudest.
Were you cognizant of that at the time and aware of that? Or was it more of just that was who you are as a person?
I mean, I had like my undergrad computer classes were the same way, right? Which is so like I had sort of like been molded to my experiences in tech well before I even got into working in tech, right? Like before I even worked in my first startup, I was in, classes where I was the only woman and had to like talk about the work that I was doing. So like some piece of that, like it didn't feel false because it was like a survival skill in terms of how I got through undergrad. It's an acknowledgement early on that like the survival skill is, okay, well, like in order to be successful in tech, I had to be loud. But the interrogation that happened years later is like, why? Why? Like that has nothing to do with my tech skills. It had nothing to do with my ability to communicate effectively or lead a team effectively. And so like, why do we have that as a core ingredient for success in tech-based organizations when you look at it, it isn't?
Yeah, it's not inclusion as a culture to say, oh, you can come in as long as you play by, the exact same communication rules as the sort of dominant hiring pattern here, right? Like it's fair game to come in and have that direct, confident leadership style be the way that you approach the work. It's not fair game to be told like you must like code switch to that because it's the only way you're allowed in the door.
Exactly. And I think that's the funny thing too with the not difference between startups and the corporate world. because it's just a circle at this point. And it is hilarious to me, even when co-working spaces first started, really becoming popular. It's like, okay, great. You can come here. It's 24/7. You've got all the beer and the kombucha and the coffee on tap that you want. And their hours, 9 to 5. They're staffed up 9 to 5. And it always blew my mind. It was like, okay, but aren't we attempting to get away from that? Are we going to do anything different, or nope. We're going to sit in meetings, except now we're sitting in them virtually. And then we're going to have more meetings to talk about the meetings.
I think it's one of the things we talk to orgs about, right? So like back in the before times when all the work that we were doing was in person, we talked to organizations about getting their bosses trained. And they said, well, like, is it possible for you to do it at our office? We really don't want to we don't want to have them do the commute time, or we don't want to put them on planes. Like, can you just come to us? We're like, okay, so like what you're asking for is you want people to think about themselves and their work in a really different way in the exact same place that they show up for work every single day. Like we're missing a core ingredient here.
But you sound so weird when you go in and you talk to a team and you say, there's a physicality to the work. Listen, you've got to, we're going to bring you into our space, right? And the chairs here don't have wheels. They're very grounded because you can't fuck with them. You're just supposed to sit in them so we can do some work. A lot of our mistake early on was selling content, was saying we have all the knowledge. We've accumulated the knowledge over 20 years. We can teach you the things that we know, with the facts that we know about management. And that's true and valid and important. But so much of what has made our programs really work is the design, is the sort of space making around it so that people can do that deeper transformation and reflection.
But if you try and walk into conversations with the HR leaders and start from fundamentally a key ingredient in transformation is that you need to be able to see yourself in a different way, and you need permission to do that. And one of the things that's going to help is being in a different space than you're in all the time. They look at you like you have 3 heads. Even in that moment, you're you can be right and still be wrong. You can be correct and still have people be no, we're not ready for that.
It's weird. We cite this essay series all the time from one of the people at the sort of core planning group for Burning Man, talking about how you create the conditions for transformation. And it's almost never on an HR checklist for management training. It's okay, you do feedback, good. You do some compensation stuff, that's great. Where's your Burning Man philosophy? Do you have a point of view on the role of Rogerian psychology in really opening people up there? It doesn't come up so much.
In terms of how you're building raw signal, in terms of how you're going against the grain in that regard, when most folks start a business, they go out, they form an LLC, S Corp, C Corp, or occasionally find some good folks out there who are willing to start a benefit corporation. And for those of you who don't know, a benefit corporation is different from the others I mentioned because the business is allowed to put their mission over shareholder profits. So to go even further, some folks who are hardcore dedicated to their mission, like these 2 folks, they go on to become certified B Corps, which leads me to my next question, which is, what is a certified B Corp? And how did you decide to go down that path to become certified?
We knew we wanted to be a certified B Corp from the very beginning. From the moment of founding, if you sort of asked us what's the name of the business and what are you doing, B Corp was in those conversations at the very, very beginning.
Yeah, part of that is it goes back to our origin myth that Melissa and I met in the early days of Mozilla, and Mozilla is a very weird organization because it's a not-for-profit that was making hundreds of millions of dollars, which you're not allowed to do as a not-for-profit, and because Firefox was too successful, and so they've got this weird structure, but it meant that a bunch of people at Mozilla in those days were how might we build corporations that care about mission? And so when the B Corp stuff started to really emerge in earnest, we all clocked it. And that was years before Raw Signal Group. And so for Melissa and me, it's just a really easy touchstone to be we should do this in a way that we're proud of.
And it felt really obvious to us that if you have it baked into not only sort of how you're incorporated, right? If you have it baked into the fabric of your organizations and have an external body as a checkpoint to ensure that you say these things are important to you, that's great. I've written a lot of marketing copy in my life, saying those things are important to you, step 1, but having an external validating body say, not only are they important to you, but are they how are they showing up in the way that you work, has been profound in ways that even though B Corp was in our discussions in the very beginning, has mattered in the trajectory of sort of our organization in ways that I did not anticipate.
Yeah, well, and there's one thing I would say too, especially if anybody listening is thinking about it for themselves. the certification is almost secondary. Like the badge, we're proud of the badge. And when we see other companies that have the badge, we're like, man, you went through some shit. Because it's like, it is a process to get that thing certified. But people always think, oh, that's for marketing. You do that because it's like a feel-good brand. It's like greenwashing or whatever. Like you stick that on things so you can sell stuff to people. And I'm like, I don't think it's been it's not a marketing lever for us. It's an accountability tool that like, we want to be proud of the organization that we build, but like, we don't claim to know everything that a company could think about. And so like, when you run through it and it's like, have you actually written down a whistleblower policy? Have you been clear about like your parental leave policy? Like, just having to go through that is really illuminating. And if you get to the bottom of it and you're like, I don't want to pay the certification fee, then don't. Like,
but the process of going through and answering all of those questions, one, as co-founders, is a really important exercise in terms of what is the organization that we're building and how do we want to think about these things. So it's very like unifying in that way. From an organization perspective, it means that we had a bunch of maturity when we were like, back when we were a 3-person organization, we had a better parental leave policy than almost every startup I had worked at.
And how do you think that perspective and going through that process has been able to transform and or inform how you've been running the business, and maybe even touching on the client policy that you mentioned earlier about folks you're not willing to work with?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good example, right? I think like without sort of enumerating the entire questionnaire, because there's a lot of them, but they break into groups, and some of them are about sort of how do you show up in the community and how do you treat your employees and stuff like that. And one of the questions was for your major suppliers, outside of your rent, whoever it is that you pay the most, do those companies pay a living wage to their employees? And I'm like, man, like we had come up with, we should definitely pay a living wage to anyone that we're working with. But like, do we have a policy to ask, like, you know, for a cleaning service, do we have a policy to ask like how their employees are treated? Well, we didn't. And we looked at that question and we're like, are we comfortable saying no? We don't have an answer to that. I'm like, no, that's not what we're going to do. And so we just wrote one and we just went through our top suppliers and we're like, we got to ask this question. And we made some changes as a result of that. But like, you know, it gives you a fuller picture of where the impacts of your business are out in the world around you.
Outside of B Corp, we have a sort of corporate touchstone called Do the Right Work. And we say like, should the work be done? Like to the conversation earlier about like sometimes not understanding that tech could be harmful, right? So asking the right question and sort of having it baked in, like, should the work be done? Should the work be done by us? Will it have lasting impact? And will we be proud of it? Is a 4-step question process that we use for every piece of work that we do here. But like the flip side of it is that like, it means that sometimes you get 3 out of 4 and you still have to say no.
Totally. And what do you do during those times?
You say no.
Say no.
And that's
but
it.
like, that's it. And you can be an organization that says like, yeah, but you're saying no to profit. And like, that's where the B Corp backstop is like, yes, the whole idea is that we should be an organization when the right call for our mission is to say no to profit, that we can do that and not look back.
It works better than you think to just ask yourself, will I be proud of it? Proud is one of those words that like, it activates everything inside you about like, how do you feel about this work? And it's pretty easy to get to a yes, but it's also very obvious when the answer is a no and you're trying to like force it, and that it's worth just dragging that out onto the carpet to say like, why is that? Why is this not just an easy yes? What am I worried about here?
Totally. And I think that goes into more of the personal side of things, more of the feelings side of things. And for those of you who haven't put together yet, these two are married. And so my question would be, how do you navigate the ups and downs of not only a relationship and a personal relationship, a friendship, a family, and being able to build such a successful company?
For us, it really works. But the minute you're in a married co-founders club, like the first question from everybody is like, woof, I could never. And you're like, that's not a question. That's actually not a question. That's a judgment. Like that's literally like the most judgmental thing. And the answer is like, well, maybe you could never. Like, I don't need everybody to be married co-founders, but I think one of the things that works about it is Jonathan and I were colleagues once upon a time, a million years ago, and we really liked working together. And so when we were sort of starting Raw Signal Group, a lot of the things that we liked in terms of working with each other, like a decade ago, maybe more,
yeah.
Sort of came into play.
I think that's a big piece of it, that we knew what it was like to work together before we knew what it was like to build a family together. I am not only a member of Married Co-Founders Club, I'm also a member of Divorce Club. And like a cool thing about divorce is that like you go through some shit. And then when you come out the other side, you know yourself better, or at least you should. Why go through a divorce and squander that opportunity? And so like figuring out how to communicate about like what you need and what's working. And like, I'm pissed off about this thing, but I'm trying to figure out how to say that. Like that's stuff that in a business context, you're going to come into all the time. Like every co-founder does. Like we joke about it. We're like, on the one hand, married couples say to us, man, I could never work with my partner. Right. But on the other hand, we talk to co-founders and we're like, how do you co-found without being married? Like,
or like without
how
living,
is there room for any other, like what does your spouse get to talk to you about? Like,
or without being roommates. Cause like stuff comes up and it doesn't always Lindsay, to your point, it doesn't always happen between 9 and 5. And so we're like, how do you navigate when like an email comes in at like 10 o'clock at night?
And I've seen people who say like, the trick is balance. The trick is saying, when we close the laptops, we've closed the laptops, and then we just change gears into our married. And if it works for you, that's great. I'm not dunking on it, but it's not my experience of it. My experience of it is much more braided. That it's like, I'm going to go do this thing while you chase that thing, and then we're going to come back together when the kids are asleep. And like maybe we'll talk about work, and maybe we'll talk about movies or travel or whatever. But like, there isn't such a clean boundary. Maybe that's good advice. It just, it isn't my experience of it for us.
No, it's all like more integrated than that.
Is there any specific boundaries that you have set up?
We try to be really respectful of the kids. And like really respectful of the kids is like, there's a founder thing where like every time you touch your phone, there's something else for you to do. Every time. Like 100% of the time, there's something there. You can fall into it. You can like, really like it will just reward every time you pick it up. And so just trying to be really respectful that like there are moments and pauses in terms of what our family needs from us, and just trying to be not both founding and parenting at the same time is like a thing I think we work pretty hard at.
Yeah, our kids know the rule, no screens at the table, right? And like and it doesn't need to be enforced very often. It's just sort of part of the rhythm of the house that if we're at the table, if we're eating, it would be wild for someone to pull out a screen. Like that would just, everybody would stop and sort of look at that person and be like, is something wrong? Is that like...
But I'd say like the flip side of that is that they are so wonderful and accommodating when we say like, we've got a work thing and we need to like finish this up, and they will sit and do art for an hour while they're waiting for us to finish and be cool about it. And I think in part the last 2.5 years had a bunch of blending of, we were working, they were doing virtual school, we were trying to make it all go. And like they know, right? Like they want Raw Signal Group to succeed too. And they're like, okay, well, we'll like go over here and figure this thing out, and you all do the work you need to get done. Like, I think the blending piece, I'd say, however you felt about it pre-2020, like after that, everything was just deeply sort of on the table.
Yeah, I know my daughter very intentionally has now figured out how I can still be on a Zoom call or even recording a podcast, and she can somehow finesse her way into the room like a ninja and stay off camera and still figure out how to get something out of it.
Yep. Well, like the general rule of the universe is that they don't actually need anything until you hit the record button, and then suddenly it is urgent.
No doubt about that.
Absolutely on fire.
One last question on the personal side of things for both of you separately. Do you have any personal habits, rituals, anything that assists in you staying grounded and present as you're being a parent, being co-founders, being in relationship, growing, being a human out in society?
I feel like I am often an agent of chaos in my own life. And one of the things I really appreciate about my co-founder is that Jonathan comes to a day with just more structure baked in. And so I like kite off of like, breakfast is a thing that happens regardless of whether you think it's a thing that needs to happen. It's a thing that's happening. And like coffee is a thing that happens. And like, I just think it's one of the places where like the dynamic is really helpful. Is like, I don't bring that structure to my own life, but it's really nice to hang out with somebody who like has that baked in as an assumption of like, you're not going to sleep until noon.
Yeah, there are pieces, right, where that's like, we have an intentionally overwrought way that we make coffee.
As like, do I.
Right. And it's like, it's very delicious, but part of it is that it's ritual. Part of it's that every morning when your brain is not really awake, you do the same things in the same order and you get to a good result. Right. And there's a couple of those through the day. Like we've done this thing where we've damaged our team, and now everybody at around 10:30 in the morning is like, are we having chips? Is it time for chips? And like,
Incredible.
daily chips is not a sensible choice. It's not a good dietary choice. It doesn't have to be a lot of chips, to be clear. But it's like this thing where even when they're working remote at 10:30, people are like, it's chip time. Are we going to get on Zoom and do chips? Like, is that happening? Because it's just like your blood sugar's low. You got another hour and a half till lunch anyway. Like, your day doesn't have to be that structured. But what we found is that it creates a cadence within the day that is often pretty useful.
We had a team member just get back from travel and they brought chips for everyone as the present in terms of coming back. We also have a little low key mission, which is if you're somewhere and there's a weird chip that nobody's tried, you have to go bring it for the rest of the office.
Oh, totally. Well, I mean, you're in Canada. What is that? Ketchup chips? That's Canadian?
Ketchup chips, all dressed chips. We just got all the best chips up here.
Incredible. I mean,
Masala chips are everywhere right now.
ooh, I missed out on those last week. I'm sad now. We'll have to.
I'm laughing because masala chips are cool unless you have a mango allergy, and then they're not cool.
Noted. Noted. Oh, man. Incredible. Ugh. Well, before we wrap up, we do ask every guest the same 2 questions, which is now 4 questions. But for both of you, separately, what is the worst piece of advice that you've ever gotten? And then to wrap it up, what is the best advice that you've ever gotten?
Worst piece of advice I ever got was early in my career. I was told you need to stick it out and either stay at the bad job with the toxic boss until you hit a year because you need it on your resume, or stay at the bad job with the toxic boss until you get another job. Worst advice.
So I had a pretty similar piece of bad advice, but I will skip that one because we've already heard it. Though definitely I have received that advice. I mean, just to sort of bring it back, when we were starting Raw Signal Group, we talked to, we know a bunch of people in startup, we know a bunch of investors and stuff. And one of the things one of the investors said is, the first rule of investing, don't you? We said, what's that? What's the first rule of investing? And they said, never invest in married co-founders. And I think they were trying to be whimsical, but also fuck you, right? And I think the thing you're supposed to take from it is be careful. This will probably fail, right? That statistically you're doomed. And I'm I'm not statistically. I'm just one person with one other person starting a company. And so this advice is not grounded in who I am or who Melissa is. It's grounded in some trope. It made us want to prove that advice wrong. So in that way, it was probably helpful, but it's just garbage. Don't say that to people. Don't say that to people.
Best advice came from around the time that the first book came out. So around the time that How Fucked Up Is Your Management was released, we got a call from my uncle, who is a sculptor in New York. And he was talking about just art things, which is so much of my life was hearing him talk about art things. But that for most of my life just went over my head. But this one connected sort of really deeply, which he said, you have to keep doing your art whether or not the audience understands what you're trying to do. The moment you make your art for the reaction, and specifically the moment you make your art in anticipation of a positive reaction, you've stopped making your art.
And we think about that one all the time.
All the time.
Because you do, we write a newsletter every 2 weeks, right? And so every time you write it, we go into this process where we're will it help? What do they need? Where can we be useful, right? And those are useful muses for us to say, where can we show care to thousands of people out there trying to make work better? But then when we start writing it, we cannot come from a place of will they like it? Do I need to frame this differently? How are they going to feel about it?
And specifically, a lot of the work that we do is getting people to grapple with some hard and uncomfortable shit. And you can't do that because most people don't. Do you want to grapple with some uncomfortable and hard truths about the universe? Very few people are opting all the way into that every morning. And so it is a really helpful framing to say sometimes that is what it needs to be. The newsletter needs to sort of come from that angle, or the book needs to sort of be written in a certain way. And it isn't going to make everybody feel super comfortable.
And for mine, this is weird, but I will answer your question with a piece of advice that Melissa got when I was not in the room, but that I think about a lot. So just as we were leaving our last startups to start Raw Signal Group, Melissa was talking to the board at the company where she was and talking about, we're going to do this thing, we're going to do management training, we're going to start in Toronto, but then figure out how to scale it and go global with it. And this board member said, or you could just have a nice life. We've done a deep read on that, but this idea that like it doesn't have to scale. It's cool if it does, if that's what you want, right? If it drives your sense of mission to have more impact and reach more people, if you want a lot of yachts, whatever it is, but it's actually really okay to just build an organization you're proud of that does great work every day and takes care of the people you come into contact with. And like, they didn't say all of those words, but I come back to it over and over again to say like, because there's this thing when you succeed where you're like, okay, this is great. How do we keep this going? How do we build on this? And just having that backstop to be like, or is this good? And maybe the next success is in a totally different direction. It doesn't have to be about like revenue or customers or whatever. Like, are we happy with that? Can we check in on how that's making us feel before we just assume we have to be 20% bigger in order for it to matter? And I've come back to it a lot in the last 5 years.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for being here and sharing all of these different gems that we've been able to find throughout this entire conversation. And for everyone who's listening, I will link all the links to all of their incredible books, workshops, newsletters, all the things will be in the show notes and you can track them down. So on that note, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Lindsay. This was really fun.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Cost of the Status Quo and learning the wisdom, stories, and ideas that will have you feeling inspired and ready to take on the world. If you've enjoyed this, please remember to share, rate, and review. It means the world to me and the team putting it all together. If you're looking for more information, you can find us at costofthestatusquo.com or on Instagram at costofthestatusquo. If you've got any questions or curiosity about me, you can find me at lindsaylerner.com. That's LINDSEYLERNER.com or on Instagram at Lindsay Lerner. Thanks again for listening. Hope you have an awesome day.